Hey everyone! Do you ever wonder how the Romans became one of the most powerful empires in history? Was it just because they had better weapons, or did they have something else that made them unstoppable on the battlefield? Well, today, we're diving deep into Roman army's craziest battle tactics. Tactics so brilliant and sometimes downright wild, they still leave historians scratching their heads. Stick around, because what you're about to hear will change how you look at ancient warfare forever. From surprise maneuvers to terrifying psychological warfare, you won't believe some of the insane methods they use to dominate their enemies. Ready? Let's jump in. The Roman army was a force of nature. No other military organization in the ancient world matched the Roman legions in terms of both their strategic brilliance and the sheer scale of their influence. At its height, the Roman Empire controlled vast territories, from the wind-swept highlands of Scotland to the sun-drenched sands of Egypt. So how did the Romans, a small city-state, rise to become one of the most powerful empires in history? One of the biggest reasons was their military. It wasn't just about their weapons. It was their tactics that made them nearly invincible on the battlefield. The Romans were military innovators. They understood the importance of adaptation and were willing to experiment with new ideas, mixing the best elements of other armies with their own ingenious strategies. The Roman military wasn't just about strength and power. It was about precision, discipline, and adaptability. They constantly tested and perfected their battle tactics, making them an unstoppable force. Let's break down some of the most brilliant and craziest strategies that helped the Romans dominate their enemies, even when outnumbered or outmatched. The Testudo formation, the human tank. Let's kick things off with one of the most famous Roman tactics, the Testudo formation. You've probably seen it in movies, but let's talk about what made it so incredibly effective. The Testudo, meaning tortoise in Latin, was a formation designed to protect soldiers from enemy missiles, and it was one of the Roman army's most famous defensive strategies. Picture this. You're a soldier in a Roman legion and you're heading into battle. The enemy is lining up archers and slingers, ready to bombard you with a rain of arrows and stones. It sounds bad, right? But not for the Romans. As soon as a command is given, every soldier in the legion moves into position. The soldiers in the front and on the sides raise their shields to form a wall, while those in the middle and rear raise their shields above their heads, creating a roof. The result is a moving, shielded fortress, allowing the soldiers to advance under protection of a nearly impenetrable barrier. This formation wasn't just about defense. It was about offense, too. The Testudo allowed the Romans to advance toward enemy lines under heavy fire, while maintaining discipline and coordination. The Romans would march forward, with their shields blocking incoming projectiles, until they reached the enemy's line. Then, with their shield protecting them on all sides, they would break into close combat, where they were incredibly effective. The Testudo was like a human tank, marching forward through enemy defenses, and it allowed the Romans to remain in formation, moving as one, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The Testudo was a perfect example of Roman training and coordination. Each soldier knew exactly where to position themselves, and the formation could be quickly deployed in the heat of battle. This allowed the Romans to march into battle with confidence, knowing that they were protected by their shields and by the unity of their unit. But there was one thing that set the Testudo apart from other shield formations: its mobility. While it was an incredibly defensive tactic, the Romans were able to use it to advance, giving the edge over other armies who relied more on static formations. The double envelopment, encircling the enemy. Let's move on to one of the most brilliant strategies ever employed on the battlefield, the double envelopment. This tactic is one of the most famous examples of Roman military ingenuity, and it's a strategy that has been studied in military academies around the world. The principle of the double envelopment is deceptively simple. Surround your enemy on both sides, trapping them and preventing their escape. But executing it perfectly is another matter entirely. The double envelopment is most famously associated with the Battle of Cannae, where the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca used it to devastating effect against the Romans. Hannibal, one of history's greatest tacticians, faced an army that far outnumbered his own. But rather than engaging in a head-on clash, Hannibal allowed the Romans to advance into the center of his forces, creating the illusion that his army was retreating. The Romans, confident in their superiority, pressed forward, thinking they had the upper hand. But that was exactly what Hannibal wanted. Once the Romans had advanced deep enough into his lines, he ordered his forces on the flanks and rear to encircle them, trapping the Roman soldiers from all sides. The result was one of the most disastrous defeats in Roman history. It's estimated that the Romans lost as many as 70,000 soldiers that day, compared to fewer than 10,000 Carthaginians. The double envelopment was a classic example of how the Romans were willing to learn from their enemies and adapt their strategies to create something even more deadly. What made this tactic so brilliant wasn't just the physical encirclement of the enemy. It was the psychological manipulation that went into it. Hannibal's forces didn't just outnumber the Romans, they outsmarted them. The Romans had no idea they were walking into a trap until it was too late. And by the time they realized it, they were surrounded on all sides. The double envelopment is a perfect example of how the Romans used both military cunning and psychological warfare to defeat their opponents. The feigned retreat, luring the enemy into a trap. Another Roman tactic that demonstrated their mastery of battlefield psychology was the feigned retreat. Imagine this. You're on the battlefield, and the enemy is bearing down on you with everything they've got. It looks like the fight is lost, and your soldiers are retreating. The enemy, thinking they won, charges forward, eager to finish you off. But just when they think they're about to wipe you out, you turn around and launch a vicious counterattack. This is exactly what the Romans did with the feigned retreat. Roman generals would often order their forces to appear as if they were retreating, deliberately breaking their lines to make it look like they were losing. The enemy, seeing an opportunity for victory, would chase after the retreating Roman soldiers. But this was exactly what the Romans wanted. As the enemy broke formation to pursue them, the Romans would regroup and turn back on them, catching the enemy in a vulnerable, disorganized state. The feigned retreat relied on several elements: timing, discipline, and psychological manipulation. It worked best when the Romans had a smaller force or when the enemy's confidence was high. One of the most famous examples of this tactic was during the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. In this battle, the Romans were ambushed by Germanic tribes in a dense forest. Outnumbered and in unfamiliar terrain, the Roman soldiers staged a retreat, leading the Germanic forces deeper into the woods. Once the enemy was fully committed, the Romans turned on them and decimated their forces. The feigned retreat is an excellent example of the Romans' understanding of human behavior. They knew that most armies, when faced with what appeared to be a retreat, would be too eager to chase their enemies, abandoning their formations and discipline in the process. The Romans used this psychological weakness to their advantage, turning what looked like a defeat into a spectacular victory. The scorched earth strategy, breaking the enemy's spirit. Sometimes, the Romans didn't even need to engage in battle to win. One of their most brutal but effective tactics was the scorched earth strategy. This tactic involved the systematic destruction of anything that could be useful to the enemy. The Romans would burn crops, destroy villages, and poison wells, leaving the enemy with no resources to survive. Julius Caesar famously employed this strategy during his conquest of Gaul. As he moved through the region, his legions destroyed everything in their path. The goal wasn't just to weaken the enemy's military strength, but to break their morale. By depriving them of food and shelter, the Romans made it impossible for the Gauls to continue resisting. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about demoralizing the enemy and making them feel hopeless. When the Romans used the scorched earth tactic, they weren't just fighting a battle. They were waging psychological warfare. This strategy had long-lasting effects. Once the enemy's land was destroyed and their people were starving, it became much harder for them to organize an effective resistance. The Romans were ruthless in this regard, but they understood that the war was as much about willpower as it was about strength. Breaking the enemies with a fight often proved more effective than any battle. Roman naval tactics, innovating at sea. Although we typically think of the Romans as masters of land warfare, they were also incredibly innovative when it came to naval combat. When Rome first went to war with Carthage during the First Punic War, they were far less experienced at sea. But the Romans were quick learners. Realizing that they needed to close the gap with Carthage's superior naval forces, the Romans developed a groundbreaking naval tactic, the corvus. The corvus was a massive spike that could be dropped from the Roman ships onto the enemy vessels, effectively locking the two ships together. This allowed Roman soldiers, who were highly trained in close-quarters combat, to board the enemy ships and fight hand-to-hand. The Carthaginians, who were used to long-range naval combat, were caught off guard. The corvists turned naval warfare into something more familiar to the Romans, land-based fighting, where their soldiers excelled. The Romans didn't just copy what the Carthaginians were doing. They adapted and innovated. The corvists allowed the Romans to fight the Carthaginian navy on their terms, and in doing so, they secured Roman dominance over the Mediterranean. It wasn't just about having the biggest fleet. It was about using the right tactics at the right time. The Roman legion structure, efficiency in numbers. Before we dive deeper into some of the other crazy tactics the Romans used, let's talk about the structure of the Roman army itself. The backbone of the Roman military was a legion, a highly organized and flexible unit designed to adapt to various combat scenarios. A single Roman legion typically consisted of around 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers, but what made a legion so powerful wasn't just the number of soldiers, it was the way they were organized. Unlike other ancient armies, which relied heavily on large, slow-moving formations, the Romans had a structure that allowed for quick adjustments on the battlefield. They divided their forces into smaller units called maniples, and each manipule could operate independently, making the Roman army more mobile and versatile than other ancient forces. The Roman soldiers, or legionaries, were highly disciplined and trained to fight in different formations and environments. This made them incredibly adaptable. The maniple system allowed soldiers to shift quickly between formations, depending on the battlefield conditions. The flexibility of the Roman army was a significant advantage over more rigid formations used by other armies. The key to the Roman legion's success was not just in the soldiers themselves, but in the way they operated as a cohesive unit. Each soldier was trained not only to fight, but to follow commands with precision. Discipline was the cornerstone of the Roman army's success. The Roman generals understood that the power of the army didn't come from overwhelming numbers, but from the ability to maneuver, adapt, and fight with unmatched unity and precision. This level of organization was what allowed the Romans to maintain control over such a vast empire. It wasn't just that they had powerful soldiers. It was that they could move those soldiers with precision, striking at the right moment and in the right place. The ability to respond quickly to changing situations on the battlefield made the Romans a force that their enemies simply couldn't keep up with. Roman military engineering, building on the battlefield. In addition to their military tactics, the Romans were also masters of military engineering. This often gave them an edge over their enemies, as they could quickly build infrastructure to support their campaigns. Roman soldiers were trained not just as fighters but as engineers, and they could construct roads, bridges, and even entire fortifications in record time. When the Romans faced a city with strong fortifications, they didn't just charge at the walls hoping to breach them. They would often build siege works, battering rams, and siege towers to break through enemy defenses. This was another example of Roman ingenuity in battle. They didn't rely solely on force. They combined their tactical genius with engineering to outsmart their enemies. One of the most famous examples of Roman military engineering was their construction of the Ager, a massive earthen ramp built during sieges to give Roman soldiers a higher vantage point. The Ager would be built around enemy fortifications, allowing the Romans to use their artillery to destroy enemy defenses, while also providing protection for their own soldiers. The Romans also perfected the use of ballistae, large crossbow-like weapons, and onagers, ancient siege engines that launched stones and other projectiles. These machines were used to break down walls, clear paths, and launch devastating attacks on enemy fortifications. The Romans didn't just conquer land, they built it. They were experts at turning the tide of war through their ability to build infrastructure on the fly. Whether it was constructing a bridge over a river in the heat of battle or creating a fortress to protect their troops, Roman engineers were essential to the success of their military campaigns. The psychological warfare, fear as a weapon. Roman battle tactics weren't just about physical strength and clever strategy. They also understood the importance of psychological warfare. Fear can be just as powerful a weapon as any sword or spear, and the Romans knew how to use it to their advantage. One of the most effective ways the Romans used fear was through intimidation. The Romans would often display the bodies of captured enemies to send a message to those who might resist. The bodies would be mutilated and left on display to show the consequences of defying Roman power. This had a profound effect on enemies, making them think twice before engaging in battle with the Romans. The Romans also used psychological tactics during their campaigns to break the will of their enemies. Roman generals would sometimes send out false rumors about the Roman strength or about the horrors their armies would inflict on the enemy. They understood that weakening the enemy's resolve before the battle even began was a way to win without ever lifting a sword. Another example of Roman psychological warfare was the decimation tactic. If a Roman legion was found guilty of cowardice or disobedience, the soldiers would be punished severely. In some cases, every 10th soldier in a unit would be killed by their comrades, in a process known as decimation. This brutal form of punishment kept soldiers in line and ensured that the Roman army maintained its reputation for discipline. The fear of decimation was so strong that it kept many soldiers in check, ensuring that they fought with honor and never hesitated in battle. Roman generals like Julius Caesar understood that controlling the narrative was key. By creating a reputation for ruthless efficiency and strength, the Romans could scare off potential enemies or force them to surrender before the fight even began. This form of psychological warfare made it easier for Roman armies to subdue resistance without facing a direct confrontation. The role of cavalry, fast, lethal, and mobile. When most people think about a Roman army, they often picture the heavily armored legionaries on foot, but the cavalry was also an essential part of Roman military tactics. The Romans understood that speed and mobility were key to winning battles, and they utilized cavalry units to hit the enemy where they were weakest. Roman cavalry units were often used for reconnaissance, flanking maneuvers, and harassing the enemy's rear. While the infantry advanced in the main assault, the cavalry would circle around the enemy's flanks, cutting off any potential escape routes or reinforcements. The Roman cavalry wasn't just about strength. It was about speed and precision, and it worked in tandem with the Roman legions to create a well-rounded, lethal fighting force. The Romans also perfected the use of the cataphract, a type of heavily armored cavalry. These elite cavalrymen were mounted on horses that were protected by armor, and they were trained to charge into the enemy with devastating force. While the Romans didn't rely solely on cavalry for their victories, they certainly understood its importance in battle. By using cavalry as both an offensive and defensive weapon, the Romans could keep their enemies on their toes and force them to fight on multiple fronts. Cavalry units were also crucial for the Romans during their many wars of expansion. In the deserts of North Africa or the vast plains of Eastern Europe, cavalry played a vital role in tracking down fleeing enemies and disrupting supply lines. The mobility of the Roman cavalry allowed the legions to control large territories and rapidly respond to threats, keeping their empire secure and their enemies in constant fear. Roman military innovations, from pilum to gladius. The Romans were not only tacticians, they were also innovators in the development of weapons. The pilum and the gladius are two examples of how Roman soldiers were equipped with weapons designed for efficiency and effectiveness. The pilum was a type of throwing spear that the Romans used to great effect. It was designed with a flexible iron shaft that would bend upon impact, making it difficult for the enemy to throw it back. This was a clever design that rendered the weapon useless to the enemy, forcing them to discard it. The pilum would often be used to disrupt enemy formations before the legions advanced in close combat. The gladius, on the other hand, was a short sword that was perfect for close-quarters combat. The gladius was designed for stabbing rather than slashing, making it ideal for the tight, organized formations the Romans used in battle. Roman soldiers were trained to fight in close ranks, and the gladius was the perfect weapon for this type of fighting. Its short length allowed for quick, precise strikes, and it could easily find its mark in the gaps between enemy shields and armor. Roman weaponry wasn't just about raw power. It was about creating tools that were specifically designed for the type of warfare the Romans excelled at. The combination of the pilum and gladius made the Roman soldier a formidable opponent, able to fight at range and then close the distance quickly for deadly, precise strikes. In conclusion, the Roman army's battle tactics were not just a product of their time. They were ahead of their time. From their innovative formations like the Testudo to the brilliant strategies like the double envelopment, the Romans understood that true military success didn't come from sheer force alone. It came from a combination of discipline, psychological warfare, engineering prowess, and an ability to adapt on the fly. They knew how to manipulate their enemies, not just on the battlefield, but in their minds as well. The feigned retreat, for example, shows just how the Romans could turn the tide of battle by exploiting the overconfidence and rashness of their opponents. This tactic, along with their ruthless scorched earth strategy, shows that the Romans didn't just defeat their enemies, they broke their spirit. The Romans understood that war was as much about the will to fight as it was about the ability to fight. The Roman military wasn't just about soldiers. It was about an entire culture of innovation. Their engineers built war machines and infrastructure at a pace that outstripped their enemies, while their cavalry ensured that their forces remained mobile and versatile. And it wasn't just foot soldiers and generals. The entire Roman legions worked like a well-oiled machine, adapting quickly and decisively to any situation. These crazy tactics and brilliant strategies didn't just secure the Roman Empire's dominance for centuries. They also set the stage for modern military thinking. Many of the tactics used by the Romans, such as the double envelopment and psychological warfare, are still taught in military academies around the world today. So, next time you think about the Roman Empire, remember, it wasn't just their powerful legions or mighty weapons that made them great. It was their unparalleled ability to think strategically, adapt quickly, and fight smarter than anyone else. The Roman army's greatest weapon wasn't just their soldiers. It was their minds. If you found this video engaging, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with fellow history enthusiasts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.